Shabbat Shalom. Why the plagues? Why? Why did God unleash the plagues on Egypt? To get their attention. Did he think of maybe ringing a bell? Maybe take out an ad in the New York Times? That getting their attention may have been a function of the plagues, but that doesn't explain why that was the way to get the attention. Why not giant letters in the sky, let my people go? It also got our attention, very true, but so would giant letters in the sky, or hieroglyphics if you want. It was related to the gods they worship. It was judgment against their gods. Let's call it what it was. It was punishment. Right? It was coercion. It was to convince them to let us go, because the consequences of keeping us any longer would be too unbearable. But it was also punishment. It was judgment against them for the hundreds of years of slavery, for the thousands and thousands of people that had been murdered under their repression of our people, and of course for the misery that they had caused in the meantime as well. It was punishment. God was making sure that even as we left, they would suffer for the crimes they had committed. That's okay, right? Are we uncomfortable talking about the punishment of the Egyptians? Does it make us feel queasy that God was punishing people? Well, wait a minute. Let's go back. Let's take a couple other test cases. Sodom and Gomorrah, right? How did they get destroyed? Fire and brimstone, divine smiting. It's a little bit unclear. It says upheaval. It could have been some sort of massive earthquake or other disruption of the land. Why did God choose to do this against Sodom and Gomorrah? And the other cities of the plain, I should point out. Those are just the two standout. They were evil. They were bad. We get an example of their badness in their attack upon the visitors to Lot and his family. But they were bad. They were terrible, terrible. Our tradition considers them guilty of. So that's a little bit of an English appropriation that is misappropriate. So what about getting a little back closer to home? The Israelites, we are about to leave the land of Egypt, right? And we are going off into the Sinai wilderness. We will receive the Torah, and from there we will be headed to the promised land, Israel, over and over again, the land of milk and honey. Do we get there with these people, the ones who are leaving Egypt? No, we do not. Quite famously, they don't get there. Is it because they didn't ask for directions? No, they didn't wander for 40 years, despite the cliche phrasing that's used. We lived there for 40 years until we could finally enter the land of Israel. Why did we have that extra time stuck in the desert? What's that? It was punishment. I think you're picking up on the theme. It was punishment. Punishment for not the golden calf. That is the most common answer, and it is the wrong one. It was not for the punishment. We were punished for the golden calf right then and there for those that were involved in it. But God did not say, you're not getting into the land of Israel because of this. That took actually a couple years later before we ruined it. What's that? Complaining and grumbling, but specifically the complaining and grumbling about the spies. The spies went off to the land of Israel. They came back going, oh, the people are so big, it's so terrible, it's going to be terrible, how will we ever win? And it's like, we just beat up Egypt with God's help. You think we can't take care of a few Canaanite city-states? But because of their attitude, their unwillingness to go up to the land, their fear and their trepidation, their lack of faith in God's ability to protect and defend them, God said, okay, you're afraid? Fine, stay here in Sinai for another 38 years at that point, and we'll wait till your kids grow up with a little bit more chutzpah, a little bit more faith, and a little bit more bravery. It was a punishment that they were stuck there for longer and died out in the natural way, leaving it to their children to move on to do what they could not. What about Moses? Did Moses get to see the promised land? He saw it from afar. Did he get to walk in the promised land? No. No, he did not. Why not? He was punished. Right? He was punished because he disobeyed God. Now, there's lots of different descriptions of what exactly he did that earned him that particular punishment, and this is not the place to go into that, but it was considered a punishment. So was the death of Aaron, so was the death of Miriam. It seems like God has no problem punishing people. So let me ask you, is COVID a punishment? Ooh, suddenly it got real. Wait a minute. Hold on a second. It is a plague. It is a plague by most standard definitions of plaguey type things. It is definitely a plague. But should we go ahead and say it is punishment? Before we can answer that, we have to look back. Are there other bad things that happen to good people in the Tanakh, in the Bible, that we can say are not punishments? Of course. Good. Name something bad that happened to something good, someone good. In the Tanakh. In the Tanakh. The Holocaust, of course, is a more modern example. But in the Tanakh, the entire book of Job, right? Eov, as he is known in Hebrew, Job, as he is known in English, or Job, if you mispronounce it. And it is always funny when people do that. The book of Job is entirely designed to get our attention that sometimes nice people end up with bad stuff happening to them. Because the book of Job was concerned that people might think, because of the preponderance of other punishments throughout the rest of the Tanakh, that every time something bad happened, it meant that the person to whom it happened was bad. Right? We are simple monkey brains, and we tend to draw conclusions where no conclusions should be drawn, and we tend to miss them where they should be. But in this particular case, the book of Job was concerned that people would look and say, well, if God punishes bad people, then people who have bad things happening to them must be being punished. Therefore, they were bad, and we just didn't know it. Or maybe we did know it, and we said it all the time behind their back. And therefore, we think they deserve it. Indeed, that is the opinion of the so-called friends of Job that continue throughout all of the chapters of Job, and it is quite a long book, beautiful poetry, but a little long, continue to try and convince him, as he complains that this is not fair, that he does not deserve all of the calamities that have befallen him and his own illness. They try to convince him over and over and over again, you're wrong, because God is perfectly just, and therefore if you are suffering, you must deserve it. Not such great friends, by the way, but this is the line of argument that they have. They are defending God's righteousness, God's justice for it's like 38 chapters or something. And finally, at the end of the book, God appears to them all, and he says to those who have been so passionately, so beautifully defending his righteousness, get out of here. Bug off. You guys who are defending me by saying that every bad thing that happens is because the person is bad and therefore deserves it, no, you do not understand. Get out of here. He dismisses them from the whole conversation. He says, Job, the guy who's actually suffering, is indeed righteous. And you guys can't hold a candle to him, so how dare you say his suffering is because of his sins when you're worse than him and yet you are not suffering? And then he says to Job, and as for you and your suffering, I'm afraid you can't understand. There isn't going to be a neat, tidy answer. We're not going to tie this up with a bow and say this is precisely why. It's all part of God's plan. God only gives bad things to people that they can hold and all of that. Yeah, that can be helpful. It can be reassuring. But if you think that that is the conclusive, final answer to all suffering, then you're not paying attention. It cannot be wrapped up so easily. There are going to be bad things that happen to good people. And it will remain a mystery for us exactly why those things happen. But it is not a mystery to think that they are not all punishments. If you want further examples outside the book of Job, which maybe you haven't quite gotten to in your reading of the Bible because, it's all the way near the end, what about near the beginning? The book of Bereshit. We have a lot of people in the book of Bereshit. We have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we know that Abraham was married to Sarah, and she had trouble having kids, was infertile for decades. We know that Isaac was married to Rebekah, and she had trouble having kids. She was infertile as well. And we know that Jacob was married to Rachel and Leah, and at different times, they too struggled with infertility. Indeed, throughout the Bible, beyond the book of Genesis, infertility seems to be an almost common theme among many of the most important and special women throughout the entire Tanakh. And at no point is it ever said, this is punishment, that they deserve to be infertile. It just is. It just is the problem that they are facing, what they struggle with, and indeed in the text they are struggling. And we cannot say that they are being punished with this infertility. We do see other women who do get punished with infertility, most notably David's wife, who is very snarky and dismissive to him and completely misunderstands the relationship between him, God and the people of Israel. But by and large, infertility is seen as simply being an unfortunate fact of life that causes suffering for many families. So what do we make? Is all suffering a punishment? No. Is all disease a punishment? No. Is it a test? A test still implies that it was deliberately created. And I would argue that no. We cannot say that God deliberately made Sarah infertile. That was simply part of her biology. It was part of how the random molecules of her body collided together to create a situation that was difficult for her and her family. So it is, I'm just going to push back on the idea of test, because test still requires us to imagine that it was deliberately constructed in order to cause the effect. Instead, I would argue that it was an opportunity for insight and lesson. It was an opportunity for her and Abraham to find a solution for them and their family that would work. Just as it was an opportunity for Job to see what his friends really were, and to truly plumb what had been clearly an unexamined faith. For all of Job's great righteousness and great piety, clearly he had never thought deeply about these issues. Clearly he had never thought that maybe sometimes bad things happen and we just have to call them bad. And part of the book of Job is his coming to terms with that, of him coming to realize that maybe faith is more complicated than a bumper sticker, that maybe faith is more complicated than just simple platitudes. And that is why it requires 30-some chapters of him arguing with his friends to hold that position and develop it and deepen it and to defend himself. Because one of the worst things that happens when people say, well, this is suffering, or this is a test, is it means that I now am doubting myself. I am questioning myself. I am maybe blaming myself for my situation. If only I hadn't done X, Y, and Z, then I wouldn't have gotten COVID. If only I hadn't done X, Y, and Z, then maybe I wouldn't have had that car accident, or I wouldn't have lost that relationship, or I wouldn't have lost that job. Or maybe the reason I'm in this bad relationship, bad job, or having this difficulty is God is testing me, and I must rise to the occasion. And that means I have to put up with it. No. There's a very famous story in the Talmud of Rabbi Yonatan being ill. And Rabbi Yonatan is considered to be a healer. He is somebody that has gone to others in need and helped heal them, which, by the way, I should remind you, is ultimate proof that every sickness is only an opportunity for us to help others. For if not, healing wouldn't work. If God did not want the sick to get better because he was punishing them, he wouldn't let medicine be effective, nor the abilities of someone like Rabbi Yochanan to help bring, or Yonatan to help bring them out. But now he is sick, and the Talmud says, if you are the one sick, you cannot lift yourself out of the pit. You need someone to stand outside to help lift you up. And so his friend goes to visit him. And his friend asks him why he is sick and what is going on and all of this. And it's a very long and beautiful conversation, which I'll spare you some of the details today. But at the end he says, is this suffering dear to you? Meaning, are you finding spiritual and personal meaning by going through this suffering? Because that can happen. Sometimes we can take the opportunity from our problems and tragedies to reframe our understanding of life and to rise a stronger and better person. And Rabbi Yonatan, great sage that he is, says no. No, this is not dear to me. I am not finding this to be an opportunity to explore God's depth of the depth of God's love. I do not want reward for having survived this kind of suffering. Help me. Don't let this continue so that I can earn more brownie points in the heavenly tribunal. Help me escape this suffering. And his friend reaches out and indeed brings him healing. And that is the Jewish answer to the suffering. Yes, it is complicated, and we will never know exactly why a person suffers. Maybe they are being punished. It is possible. We know Sodom and Gomorrah was. We know the Israelites were. We know Moses was. But that doesn't mean that we don't give healing where possible. It doesn't mean we don't act to help alleviate suffering wherever we have the capability. When we see somebody in need, we don't wonder what they did to deserve it. We wonder what we can do to fix it. And that is the ultimate Jewish response to whenever we see suffering. It is why I am sure most of you instinctually feel uncomfortable reading about the plagues that attacked Egypt. Because you know, like I have just said, perhaps on an instinctual level, that when there is suffering, we're supposed to step forward and try and fix it. And you can imagine seeing the Egyptians suffering and thinking, well, that's not right. Here, let me help you. Hold on. If you don't have clean water, I've got some clean water because God didn't afflict my rivers. And that is indeed the right Jewish response. To see somebody in need is to see somebody that you can help, not to see somebody that you can judge. And that is the only way we will get through this COVID plague. It is the only way we will be able to overcome any of the suffering that different people experience. Like I said, in the story of Rabbi Yonatan, no one can lift themselves out of their own pit. It takes someone else to help them rise. Be that someone else. See others in need and do not blame them for their condition, but ask what you can do to help. And then do it. Shabbat Shalom.